Welcome to today's Wednesday Lowy lunch. My name is Anthony Bubalo. I'm the director of the West Asia program here at the Lowy Institute. In the last year, we've seen a gradual, but I think nevertheless quite remarkable shift in the way that the two wars that have come to define the first decade of the 21st century, the way these wars have come to be perceived. When it was launched in 2001, the war in Afghanistan was by and large adjudged to have been a just and reasonable response by the US to the attacks of 9/11. By contrast, Iraq was seen by many as a war of choice, whose disastrous consequences in the years following the initial invasion seemed to underline, the initial invasion in 2004 seemed to underline the folly of launching the war in the first place. Yet nothing quite succeeds like success, and nothing quite fails like failure. In the last year, perceptions of the two wars have started to shift as the situation in Iraq has improved while that in Afghanistan has grown worse. I'm not sure that's shifted yet to the point where perceptions have become totally reversed, where Afghanistan has now become the bad war and Iraq has become the good one. Nevertheless, I wonder whether we might not be that far from a point where US allies are deflected from calls from Washington for more support in Afghanistan by saying, US allies deflect US calls for more support in Afghanistan by telling the US that whilst they can't help out in Afghanistan, they're more than happy to help out in Iraq. Against this background, we're very lucky today to have with us someone who can talk in a meaningful, interesting, and indeed a personal way about these two wars and the potential lessons that one has for the other, and indeed for other similar conflicts. Lydia Khalil served as a political advisor to the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, where she worked closely with Iraqi politicians on political negotiations and constitutional drafting. Before her arrival in Australia, she was a counter-terrorism advisor with the New York Police Department. She's published extensively on issues relating to the Middle East, on terrorism and counter-terrorism, and is working on a forthcoming book on Iraq. She was born in Cairo, in Egypt, and is a native Arabic speaker. She also recently travelled to Afghanistan. Finally, Lydia is a visiting fellow and lecturer at Macquarie University Centre for Policing, Intelligence and Counter-Terrorism. And last and certainly not least, she's a non-resident fellow in the Lowy Institute's West Asia program. Please join me in welcoming Lydia Khalil.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I think the Lowy lunches offer a really great forum to discuss these issues. And what I'm going to try to do is limit my remarks as much as I can so we can have a good discussion about the topics that we have. Like Anthony said, I've had a chance to both work in Iraq and travel to Afghanistan. And from there, I hope to share some of the lessons learned and anecdotes and experiences that I've had there as we kind of go along with this discussion. But first, I think I need to get my notes in order. I was in Iraq in the early days in 2003 and 2004, and I just came back a month ago from a research trip to Kabul. And there I was really able to learn a lot more from the practitioners, and also to talk a lot to the citizens, the everyday people, the shopkeepers, and the politicians in that area to see how our policies are affecting them. And really, since my time working in both places, there have been a couple of questions that have preoccupied me. One, as we mentioned before, are there any lessons learned from one theater that can be applied to the other? Are there any lessons that can be applied to any future conflict areas? Or is the only lesson to be had is that we shouldn't be involving ourselves in these type of things in the first place? So these are the type of questions that I want to discuss with you today. And even though the topic today has stressed commonalities and lessons learned, I kind of want to begin by stressing the differences between Iraq and Afghanistan, because I think it's very important to acknowledge this outright. They're clearly two very different conflicts, two very different countries. Afghanistan, it's a largely tribal, mountainous society. The levels of development there have been far below Iraq and also the rest of the countries around the world. The stabilization operation there through NATO is extremely diffuse. There are a lot of actors with various interests at hand, so coordination issues are difficult. And also throughout Afghanistan's history, there's been this issue of the lack of government control. Governments, going back into history, have had a very difficult time controlling the entire swath of Afghan territory. Iraq, by contrast, is a fairly urban environment. It's had high levels of education and development prior to the sanctions until that isolated the country from the rest of the world. Tribal ties are important, but they're not dominant. And the post-war operation in that area is pretty much under the clear leadership of the United States. While the U.S. does have allies there, everyone's singing from the same sheet of music. There's clear leadership and direction there. So we don't have the same kind of coordination issues that we deal with in Afghanistan. And Iraq, lastly, has had that problem of too much government rather than too little. We've had to kind of take that grip of central control out of Iraq and kind of diffuse it to the provinces and to other regional actors. So these are just some of the basic differences that we need to acknowledge, and these nuances are important as you go about formulating a reconstruction strategy. But I think there's one major difference that I think is a false difference, and I'd posit this to you today in the talk, and Anthony touched upon it a little bit in his intro. And this is the idea that Afghanistan is the right war and Iraq is the wrong war. Now, there are clearly reasons for this. There was a direct hit on American soil that led to the invasion of Afghanistan because there was a clear connection to it. It was a widely legitimate operation, at least in the beginning. Iraq is a war of choice, and a bad choice at that, predicated on false or exaggerated intelligence. Now, while that might have been important in the beginning to have this debate, and it still is, I'd say to you that in terms of looking at reconstruction strategy, it's not the focus that we need to continue to have. For better or for worse, these two countries are part of a similar struggle. The struggle to stabilize two very important yet unstable regions of the world, and also it's part of that struggle to fight against Islamic extremism that affects those areas in the Middle East and Asia and also in the West. So they've kind of become a multi-front war, not quite a global insurgency as some people have suggested, but it's part of that same effort. And so that's where this talk about lesson learned is going to be going. I want to start off by kind of going through 10 lessons that I've kind of managed to preliminarily think through, and hopefully that can be an impetus for future discussion later on. And one of the first lessons I wanted to bring out is this need to start at the grassroots and to engage indigenous leaders. Now, one of the first things that coalition officials do, or international partners do when they go in there, is they try to sniff out partners. People who can act as conduits to the real people in the communities and the grassroots. Now, who are those partners? Usually they're exiles or opportunists, or if they're neither one of those, they're people who kind of exaggerate their influence in order to get the access and the funding from coalition efforts. So, one of the most high-profile examples of this phenomenon is somebody like Ahmed Chalabi. He's been in the news. He was a clear partner for us. He spoke our language. He understood our bureaucracies. He knew how we worked. So it was very easy for us to rely on people like him and his ilk. And we were hoping that he would be the one to kind of reach out to the masses of people. And clearly it hasn't really worked that way. And as a result, these partners, they've monopolized the advice giving to international officials, and they've monopolized the projects in our time. And people at the grassroots, the ones that we're really trying to seek, often say, well, they don't understand, why are we using these people who they don't see as legitimate or as representative to their interest? The same thing occurred in Afghanistan, where we felt the need that we had to partner up with warlords who had former abuses. So by partnering up with them in such an intimate way, it reflects badly on us, because it seems like we're legitimizing their bad actions or their ineptness or their other interests. And a lot of our time and energy was put in developing these relationships, when I feel that that energy probably could have been used to go directly at the grassroots. Now, developing these multi-layered relationships, understanding the nuances at the local level, it requires a lot of time and effort. And it's much easier to go for these partners, but it's an effort that I would say to you is quite necessary. And it mitigates a lot of long-term problems that we have later on. There's a particularly well-written account called 3 Cups of Tea that talks about one person's efforts in Afghanistan to build schools. And he just talks about how building one school had done so much in order to mitigate the effects of the Taliban-led insurgency in a very volatile region. And this is the efforts of just one person. Now imagine if there was a concerted, coordinated international effort in that regard in terms of dealing with the grassroots, what type of result that we would have seen in that end. The second related lesson learned that I brought out is this need to build institutions rather than focus on personality politics. Personality politics has a huge grip on places like the Middle East and Central Asia. And that's really the result of direct neglect by their past governments in terms of institution buildings. But the international community also has a role to play in that because they perpetuate these mechanisms of personality politics because of the need to partner up. Now, building institutions and mechanisms is really painstaking work, and it requires a lot of time and effort. And so when in Australia and the United States you're faced with all these pressures in the public to get out, to reduce our footprint, the impetus really is to kind of go in, partner up quickly, focus on the personality, saying he's our man, he's going to get it done, instead of focusing on the work of the institution building. In Afghanistan, Karzai was our guy. In Iraq, it was Lowy, and now it was Maliki. But what happens when our guys start pursuing policies either that we don't agree with or detrimental to the reconstruction of that country? We don't have institutions to fall back on anymore because we've neglected that and gone along with the personality politics. The third lesson, taking it into a different bent, is this need to react at the first sign of an insurgency. I can't remember how many times when I was in Iraq giving press conferences in 2003, 2004, saying, these attacks, they're just dead enders, or they're remnants of the old guard. In reality, they weren't really remnants of the old guard, but they were signs of something new and a lot more dangerous, this multi-layered insurgency with foreign aid ties. So I can't help but wonder if we had paid more attention to these first signs of insurgencies, and if we had implemented the current counter-insurgency strategy back then, if we could have probably mitigated all the sectarian strife that occurred as a result of the insurgency and the violence. The same thing is happening in Afghanistan a couple of years ago. There was this clear need to see Afghanistan as a success that we either ignored or didn't pay attention as quickly as we should have to these warnings that the Taliban was coming through. And related to that point is a fourth lesson learned regarding the insurgency. And there's this need to wedge between foreign fighters and the local population. Iraq counterinsurgency, I would say, has only been a success because of this effort to capitalize on the differences between the indigenous insurgency and the foreign fighters. Foreign elements have absolutely nothing to lose and everything to gain by the instability and violence. They have no reason to push their indigenous partners into participating in politics. On the other hand, it's the complete opposite for indigenous insurgents. They want to be political actors. That's why they get involved in the first place, because they feel disenfranchised, and this is the only way that they've seen to kind of let their message be heard. So by trying to wedge as much as we can between the local population and these foreign elements that are frankly playing out different dramas in the conflict zone is the only way that we would be able to effectively fight the insurgency. In Iraq, you had insurgent groups like the Iraqi army. They were considered one of the most deadly groups there. They were tightly partnered with al-Qaeda, and people said they would never participate in the political process. Well, look what happened now as a result of the conflict between them and al-Qaeda. They're issuing political communiques. Their fighters are involved in the awakening councils. And they're getting ready to participate in the upcoming elections whenever they might be. So this is a clear need and a clear success in terms of fighting the insurgency. The fifth lesson, I would say, is a very obvious point, and that's the need to stem corruption. It is obvious, but I think what people don't realize is that during periods of post-conflict reconstruction, the potential for corruption is exponential. And while there have been anti-corruption programs put in place, they're often an aside and not really taken as a key element of a reconstruction strategy. In societies like Iraq and Afghanistan, patronage networks feature very prominently. Now, these are not necessarily bad, but they do have the potential to devolve into corruption. And even if we, as the international community engaged in reconstruction, are not the ones who are corrupt ourselves, it still reflects badly on us in our efforts. So I would say that corruption needs to be a key, not marginal feature in any reconstruction strategy. The sixth lesson I'd put forward is this need to engage regional partners. The need to make sure that regional partners are engaged is completely crucial. We've seen the effects in Afghanistan of how Pakistan has been a bad neighbor and affected the reconstruction there. It's very clear. In Iraq, you've seen the effects of countries like Iran and of Syria. Now, some of this, regional machinations is inevitable because there's a conflict, there's reconstruction, the tectonic shifts in regional and global powers are shifting, so there will be conflict. But some of it can be mitigated, and I think Syria is a clear example of this in Iraq. At first, Syria was an engaged partner. It had close ties to the United States, there were clear intelligence links, and they had stemmed the flow of foreign fighters. Then the Syrian-U.S. relationship devolved because of conflicts in Lebanon, various other things. And then that's when you started to see the flood of foreign fighters coming into Iraq from Syria. When Syria became re-engaged by the U.S., then it put up the block again on its borders to foreign fighters. And so that's a clear way to show how regional engagement is very important. Now, it may not seem like it at the time. It seems like we're going to be in Iraq and Afghanistan forever, but there will come a time when the international presence ends. But this is geography, and they're going to have the same neighbors. Iran is not going anywhere. Pakistan's not going anywhere. India's not going anywhere. So a regional strategy is absolutely crucial, and their real interest needs to be taken into account. We can't just put the blame on these countries by saying, oh, you're meddling and you're messing up our perfect international plan. They have real interests too, and those need to be taken into account. The seventh lesson learned that I put together is this need to develop local police forces. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the militaries of both of them and the newly constructed armed forces have become the most respected and best trained in that country. They have clearly been a success. That's a great thing. However, it has come at the expense of developing local police forces. And in the end, it's the local police forces that have to deal with these, the effects of the insurgency and internal security issues. Now, there was this great push to just get bodies in, shove the numbers into the Iraqi police force. And that's when you saw the Shia-dominated security services coming in. So not only is it necessary to get the bodies in, but they need to have proper training, not only in terms of executing security operations, but in the rule of law. And that's crucial, because these police forces didn't have adequate training, and what you saw was this sectarian violence that just erupted over the place. In the end, it's going to be these police forces that have the ties to the communities and will be responsible for the everyday safety of the population. The eighth one, lesson learned, is surrounding elections. Now, elections are big-ticket items. They grab headlines, they're clear markers of political process, and they're very important to the political progress of those countries. But Iraq carried out 3 successful elections. Afghanistan had 1 successful election in 2004. And they were considered a success at the time. But then what happened months or years later? The security situation just completely spiraled out of control. And this leaves people questioning in those countries. Well, you promised us elections, and you promised there'll be progress because of these elections. And look what happened. So it's left people questioning the utility of elections. So I would say to you that elections are key and crucial steps, but they are far from complete. And the need to educate people in terms of the nuances and depth of political and civic participation is far greater and far more necessary than holding successful elections. People need to realize that political participation goes far beyond just doing that vote. So the elections themselves can be legitimate. The 9th lesson is that interim governments have lasting consequences. Because of the U.S. and NATO presence, they don't want to be seen as the occupiers. They don't want to be there as the ones running the show, like, Viceroy, Ambassador Bremer, as he was termed. There's this clear need to build up a quick interim government in order to have an Afghan face or an Iraqi face to the process. Now, that's important, but often these interim governments are really a roughshod job. I mean, I remember being in Iraq, and we put together the governing council in the span of 3 weeks. Now, 3 weeks is clearly not enough time to put together an interim government who will lead the future of the country. So they're put together in a short time, and the eye is toward political expediency rather than political heft. So we say, well, these long-term issues are going to be carried out later. These interim governments are only going to be 6 months in office, 8 months in office, no big deal. But it does become a big deal because often these actors are involved in the future political process. We're still trying to shake Chalabi off, and he's still in power. Guys like Dostum, who have very bad records as warlords, are still in the permanent government because of the need to bring them inside that tent for an interim government. So this is kind of a major unexplored consequence of these construction operations that I think requires a little bit more thought. But I think the key is that these interim governments do have lasting consequences. And there are people who should be given political power at the outset who shouldn't have been and yet remain in power because of the legacies of this interim government. And the last lesson that I put forward to you is this need for justice and reconciliation. Now, these terms and concepts get a lot of lip service. We hear about it all the time. But somehow, when you get right down to it in the reconstruction efforts, they're not considered, realpolitik enough. But what I would say is that they are definitely a key part and not a side or marginal part of these reconstruction efforts. These are traumatized societies, and the violence is a result of that trauma. And the violence is a result of retribution, either personal or communal, ethnic or sectarian. And so it shouldn't be these efforts shouldn't be relegated to the sidelines. And it's important not only to stem violence, but also for political progress. In Iraq, the violence has gone down, but because the reconciliation process is still incomplete, you have piles of legislation stacked on the desks of the parliamentarians that aren't getting anywhere through because of this reconciliation projects. So I just want to stop there. Just think a little bit about these 10 lessons that I put forward to you. I'm sure there are many more, and hopefully we can kind of discuss some of that through the Q&A. So.
No, you've got to answer some questions. I'm not
sorry.
going
I thought you were going to go up and answer.
No, she's used to me kind of talking at length about things, so she thought she'd kind of have a rest. Okay, as is normal with the Q&A, please indicate if you would like to ask a question. Please wait for the microphone and tell us who you are, as this is being recorded for our website. And I'd also ask, again, please, if you limit yourself to a question rather than a long comment or a diatribe. Malcolm Cook. Sorry, I should also say that if you're upstairs and you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to come down and stand at the back of the room, and I'll and indicate that you want to ask.
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks, Lydia. My first question, I think, is your lesson 2 about not going